In the 1940s, Mrs. Burton lived in a stone farmhouse in a little English village in the Cotswolds, where she got about the country lanes on her bicycle. She had 3 children and her husband Len worked in the local aluminium factory. But Mrs. Burton had another, very different life. She was Ursula Kuczynski, a colonel in the Red Army and a committed communist. This diminutive housewife was in fact a highly trained spy, codenamed Sonya, who had conducted espionage missions in China, Poland and Switzerland, and who had been sent to England by Moscow, where she was secretly helping the Soviets build the atomic bomb. This is the astonishing true story that Ben Macintyre tells in his latest book on spies and espionage. It's called Agent Sonya. Hi, Ben.
Hello, Sarah. Hi.
You include some fantastic photographs in the book of Ursula at different points in her life. Is there one that when you think of Ursula, that's the image you think of?
But there is one photograph, actually, and it shows Ursula in her mid-20s in Shanghai. She's very young, and she's looking over she's drinking a bowl of coffee, I think, and she's looking over the top of it. And she herself called this photograph Portrait of a Pirate. And there's a glint in her eye. There is a kind of seductive, knowing look. And she looks straight down the barrel of the camera. And she's living this extraordinary life. And there's a vitality and a kind of intelligence to that photograph that I think, and it's very grainy, it's not a brilliant photograph, but it sort of captures this vivacious, dedicated, complicated, ideologically driven, romantic, funny, difficult, selfish, fascinating woman.
How old was she when she first got interested in politics?
In order to understand someone like Ursula Kuczynski, you have to kind of go back to that really tumultuous period between the wars in Germany. She was 17, really, when she caught what you might call the sort of communist bug, and she never, ever lost it. She became a dedicated communist at the age of 17 and never left the faith, really. She was a German Jew living in a sort of affluent part of Berlin. Her family were intellectuals and artists. And communism, from her point of view, and the point of view of hundreds of thousands, millions of other Germans, was that only communism stood between Germany and fascism. Because, of course, Hitler's black shirts were on the rise, brown shirts were on the rise. You know, for her, it was a very logical thing to embrace the extreme left.
So she was zealous about politics from a teenager. Was she also fun?
Well, that's one of the odd things about old Ursula was that, I mean, dedicated, die-hard kind of, doctrinaire communists don't tend to be much fun. They tend to finger wag and tell you which way, when the revolution's coming and. But actually, the odd thing about Ursula was that she was quite fun. I mean, she was this, in some ways, she was in some ways an extremist. I mean, she would have shed blood willingly for the revolution. And yet there was a kind of lightness to her ideology. She was prepared to listen to other people. She was good fun. And actually that was one of the things I discovered writing this book was that I in some ways I was rather nervous about it because, I was going to have to spend 3 years in the company researching and writing of a really hardline communist Soviet agent. And that I wasn't sure that was going to be a huge amount of fun. But actually, I found her company intoxicating. In some ways, I think I slightly fell in love with her.
What did she look like as a young woman, Ben?
She wasn't classically beautiful. She was very slim. I suppose the best way to describe it was that she was very alive. She was full of vitality. Her eyes sparkled. She was highly literate. She'd read everything. She was engaged with the world. And she had an electric effect, not just on men, on women as well. I mean, people fell in love with Ursula very, very quickly and very profoundly. And it's quite interesting. And she too herself fell in love very easily. I mean, her relationships were many, and each of them were very profound to her. In that way, she was a very modern woman.
Who did she, start to fall in love with one afternoon by a lake outside of Berlin?
Oh, well, this is the sort of very moving but also very tragic story of Rudolf Hamburger, who was her first love. He was an architect, a trainee student architect. They met in sort of very romantic circumstances. Again, at a time of great hope in Germany. I mean, we look back on German history as a kind of black period. But at this point, to be a young left-wing idealist, it was a very exciting time. They thought history was on their side. Little did they know. So she met Rooney, who was not a communist, actually. I mean, he was left-wing, but he wasn't a communist. Very handsome. He was charming. They fell in love. And, Ursula, as often happens when people fall in love, her life changed utterly almost overnight. They did get married, and Rudy got a job in Shanghai, building buildings for the British Municipal Council.
What sort of city was Shanghai when they arrived there in 1930?
Well, I mean, Shanghai was an extraordinary place in 1930. Because of the history of Shanghai and that part of China, the city was ruled by different international groups, really. There was an international section, there was a French section, there was a British section, and yet it was surrounded by millions of Chinese. So there were 50,000 foreigners, if you like, living in the middle of Shanghai and living quite a life in Shanghai. It was a great place of cabarets and opium dens, and dance halls and bars and restaurants, and a huge wealth in the middle of it, surrounded by a sea of Chinese poverty. I mean, people living in absolutely with nothing. And so I would have said Shanghai in 1930, when they arrived, had a pretty good claim to be the most socio-economically divided city on earth. And it was the birthplace of the Chinese Communist Party. When Ursula arrived, she lived a life to begin with of kind of domestic colonial bliss, if you like. She was going to tea parties and playing mini golf with the other expatriate wives. She found it spectacularly boring, which it was. But it was very comfortable. And yet, at the same time, going on secretly in Shanghai, a brutal underground spy war was underway because the nationalist government of China, the Kuomintang, was trying to destroy the Communist Party. It's a story we don't really know about in the West, but actually, before the Holocaust, it was one of the most appalling bloodletting episodes in history. Something like 350,000 people were murdered. And Ursula would find herself drawn into that fight, drawn into that secret underground war.
Well, who did Ursula meet at the Cathay Hotel on the 13th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution?
Well, you see, this is another extraordinary character. This is someone called Agnes Smedley. Now, all the people in this story, by the way, have extraordinary names. If you'd been around and you'd been a sort of novel reader in the 1930s, you'd probably have heard of Agnes Smedley because she was a very successful, probably the most successful woman radical novelist. She'd written a book called Daughters of Earth, which was a huge bestseller in the States. And Ursula was a fan, actually. I mean, she was sort of a fangirl. She'd read the book and she learned that Agnes Smedley was in Shanghai, so she arranged to meet her. And they had this extraordinary meeting in the Cathay Hotel, the largest hotel in Shanghai. And they discussed politics and they talked about books. And of course, what Ursula didn't realize at that point was that Agnes had in her purse, was carrying a revolver, because Agnes was secretly a spy for the Soviet Union. Agnes was not just a spy. She was coordinating with the Chinese underground. She was actively working for the revolution in Shanghai.
And then Agnes Smedley sent a man round to visit Ursula at her home. Who was that?
His name was Richard Sorge. Well, he was described by Ian Fleming, no less, the creator of James Bond, as being, and this is a quote, the most formidable spy in history, which is quite a claim, actually. And actually, it's not far off the truth. I mean, Richard Sorge was extraordinary. I mean, he was a veteran of the First World War. He was devastatingly handsome. He was highly intelligent. He was an alcoholic. He'd lost 3 fingers of one hand. And he was running all the Soviet operations in Shanghai. So he was what he was doing was really, he was pumping money and guns and information to the active communist underground with Moscow's approval. And he would go on to become a hugely successful spy for the Soviet Union. In Japan, in fact, he would move on from China to Japan. And he actually provided Stalin with advance warning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And he was that good. He penetrated the upper echelons of the whole Japanese establishment and the court and so on. So he was quite something. And he was also an extremely adept seducer.
This is the James Bond's echoes that are coming across. So when he went over to meet this young German housewife, Ursula Hamburger, as she was, only in her early 20s, what did he propose to her?
Well, initially he proposed, that she work for his network, for his organisation, that she use the flat secretly, without telling her husband, use the flat that they were renting as a safe house, really, for him to be able to meet with his underground contacts. Now, 2 points to be made immediately about this. One is the don't tell your husband aspect of this, because once you've said to someone, don't tell your husband, you're already, if you're Richard Sorge, on the road to something romantic and emotional. And the other aspect, and we'll come to that in a second, is that, of course, it was incredibly dangerous. I mean, unbelievably dangerous, because had Ursula been discovered, had it been revealed that that was what she was doing, she would have been arrested, Rooney would have been arrested, they would have been interrogated, they would have been tortured, and they would have been shot. And she was pregnant by this point. So she's already running an incredible risk. So risk, spying, espionage, they are aphrodisiacs. They really are. It's a very vital world. It's an incredibly heightened emotional state to be in. And Richard Sorge was pretty irresistible. So she began just by running the safe house, but quite soon she became Sorge's sort of close confidant. She was, looking after the arsenal, the guns that they were gathering. She was gathering information herself. She became more and more important in her relationship with Sorge. And she had a baby while this was going on. So she was also a nursing mother. And about a year after she met Sorge, he took her on a motorbike ride. And one of the things that he did was he'd power around Shanghai on this enormous German motorbike. I said to her, so she describes it very vividly. He took her for a ride on the back of the motorbike. They powered their way through the Chinese countryside. And pretty much immediately after that, they became lovers. And Sorge, I think, is really the love of Ursula's life. Not the only one, but the one that really turned her head. And when she died many, many, many years later, the only photograph she had in her study was of Richard Sorge, a framed photograph of him on the wall. And it's that combination of the emotional and the romantic with the ideological and the political that I think it doesn't explain Ursula completely, but it powered her for the rest of her life.
So they were lovers and espionage partners, but then what phone call did she get from Richard Sorge in December 1932?
Sorge was recalled to Moscow. He sent off on a new mission, and he simply called her to say, that's it, I'm going back to Moscow. And they never saw each other again. They know it was the end of that relationship. And the bottom of her world fell out, actually. I mean, that night, she described it. She was a wonderful writer, Ursula. She described it very vividly. And I think in some ways what subsequently happened was a kind of tribute to Sorge. She was sort of in the spying game because she loved him.
Ursula herself was summoned to Moscow by the Red Army intelligence branch. Did her little son, who by this stage was a toddler, did he go along with her?
Well, throughout her life, Ursula had to make a choice, really, between her espionage career, her profession as she saw it, and her familial, family, and domestic life. And yes, she was summoned to Moscow, and that was Sorge's doing. She should be trained. We need to get her on, we need to send her somewhere else. And so she was very flattered to get this invitation. But her argument was that she couldn't take her little son with her, Michael, because had she done so, he was so young, he would undoubtedly have picked up some words of Russian, and then wherever they moved on to after that would reveal the fact that they'd been in Russia. That was her story. And actually, I think it was probably true. So the marriage was breaking down by this point. I mean, inevitably. She headed off to Moscow to be trained and left her little son with her parents-in-law. What
kind of training did Ursula get in Moscow?
Well, highly intensive. I mean, she was clearly spotted as a fast riser by the Soviet Red Army intelligence. Now, bear in mind, there's a distinction to be made here because she was working for the military. There are two essential branches there still are of Soviet and Russian intelligence. One is what is now called the GRU, but then it was called the Red Army Department for the Red Army Intelligence Service. So she was working for the army for the military section of the army. And then there's the other side, which is the civilian, which is KGB or NKVD as it was then, KGB, FSB now. So there are lots of acronyms, but it's important to bear in mind that she was a soldier. She considered herself to be a soldier. And so when she arrived in Moscow, she was put under military training. She was taken to a special spy school outside Moscow called the Sparrow School, where she was trained in all the kind of complex arcana of what was then very modern technological espionage, including shortwave radios. She became a highly trained espionage technician. By the end of this training, Ursula could build you a radio out of bottle tops and string. I mean, she was that good. And again, that's very rare for a woman. I don't mean that in a sexist way. I simply mean at the time, there were very, very few women trained in this kind of technical work. Embarrassingly, fewer women than there should be in intelligence. Then they were hen's teeth. There were very, very few. I've never come across a woman in any intelligence service, let alone the Soviet Red Army intelligence service, who rose as high as she did. I mean, she was a phenomenon. And she emerged from the Sparrow School really a very, very proficient, highly trained spy.
So what mission was she given after completing that training?
Oh, she was sent off to Japanese-occupied Manchuria. And a ferocious partisan, communist-led guerrilla insurrection was taking place in Manchuria. And Ursula was sent to the city Mukden, where her job was to liaise with the communist partisans underground and to get weapons to them, to ferry information back and forth between them, to set up her radio, and to take her son with her. Her cover was that, well, in fact, she was sent with another agent, a man called Johann Patra, who was, he was a Soviet spy. He was a Lithuanian by birth. He was a sailor. He was illiterate, extremely handsome. And the two of them set up shop as if they were lovers in Mukden, working together with the communist underground. Again, unbelievably dangerous, because the Kempeitai, which was the Japanese secret police, were brutal and efficient to an extent that made the Chinese look like amateurs. To be caught there, they would have been executed. And so they set up shop as if they were new lovers, and sure enough, that is what they became, because Ursula and Johann Patra fell in love. Again, I think it is that the secrecy combined with the danger, combined with working in a sort of secret world together, creates a very particular kind of emotional.
Though once again, that relationship was cut short by Moscow because Ursula was called back and sent to Europe, where she gave birth to her second child, a daughter.
Yes, her daughter by Patra. She didn't even tell him. I mean, she was pregnant when she was going back, and they survived the Mukden period, amazingly, and she was already pregnant. She didn't tell him. She just headed back to go on the next spy. And this is what makes her so interesting, I think, that, she now had two children by two different men. She was a single mother. She was struggling for money. Her family were under deep threat in Germany. In fact, they had by this point now fled to Britain to escape the Nazi persecution. Her life is tumultuous in a way that, most of us, some of us struggle, as it were, with a work-life balance. It's one of those things that modern people talk about. Well, Ursula's work-life balance makes anything that we're having to deal with look like chicken feed, really, because, her work was lethal. Had she been caught, she would have been murdered.
Did she write about that or wonder about that fear about what that would mean, I guess, especially for her children, if she had been captured? Did that trouble her?
Greatly. For the rest of her life, Ursula was troubled. In fact, very close to her death, she wrote, I feel I have been a good spy, but a bad mother. And she felt that the balance, but in some ways she was a very loving mother. She adored her children. And she wrote very feelingly about this. One of the ways that I was able to write this book was a family. Two of the children were still alive when I was writing, allowed me access to her unpublished writings. And she goes very deeply into her feelings and her emotions and what went on inside her. So yes, the balance between protecting her family, looking after her children, giving them a good education, getting them alive in the world, and what she saw as her ideological duty is the central tension of this story. I think perhaps in the modern world, it's something that women can, listen, it's very extreme in Ursula's case, but can relate to in some ways, is that It's very hard to do both.
I've got to transmit Morse code to Moscow, but my toddler wants his morning tea. Yeah, it's true.
There were moments like that. There really were moments like that. There really were. I mean, she described at one point having to erect an aerial on top of the house in Mukden in order to be able to transmit to Moscow. And she describes this so vividly, as she climbed onto the roof, okay, pretty dangerous anyway, in order to tie this bamboo aerial. Her baby started crying down below. Now, if the housekeeper woke up, who was Chinese, they would see her on the roof. If that happened, it would be reported. So she had this kind of extraordinary moment of thinking, oh my God, my baby's crying, so I have to go down and get the baby, but I've also got to put up this goddamn aerial on the roof.
Someone's waiting in Vladivostok.
But at the time, it must have been absolutely terrifying. And those episodes happened throughout Ursula's life.
So as she's doing this sort of impossible, but somehow managing this juggle between her work in espionage and her domestic life, she was being acknowledged in the USSR. Tell me about the award she was given by Red Army officials back in Moscow in 1937.
Well, she was summoned back to Moscow in 1937 and awarded the Order of the Red Banner, which is the highest military decoration in the Soviet Union. Ursula is not only the only woman officer in the Red Army Intelligence Service I've ever come across who won it. She won it twice. She got it at this point, and then she was given another one. Now, I don't know of anybody who got two. And there was a special ceremony in the Kremlin where it was presented to her by the Russian president. You know, she would rise to the rank of colonel in the Red Army. And so, like many soldiers, she was absolutely dedicated to what she saw as her military unit. But there's another element to this. When she returned to Moscow in 1937 to receive this award, the Stalinist purges were already beginning. 1.5 million people would be murdered in the course of Stalin's search for traitors and spies. Most of them were completely innocent. And Ursula was caught up in that. Most of the comrades, as she would refer to them, and her friends and her colleagues in the intelligence were exterminated, including some people that she absolutely adored. Now, two questions arise from that. One is, how did Ursula herself survive? And I have no easy answer to that, because in a way, she was a prime target. She was Jewish. There was a strong anti-Semitic element, the wave of killing that carried out. And she was a spy, and she'd been abroad. Those were three things that marked her out for execution. And she survived. Now, I think it was probably a combination of factors. She had inspired great loyalty among some of her bosses, and I think they protected her. And she was incredibly lucky. And she got out of Moscow pretty fast. And the other question that it raises is, how much did Ursula actually know? You know, she knew more than she let on. I don't think she was ever complicit in the denunciations. I've never found any evidence of that. But I am pretty convinced that she knew what was happening and just didn't dare really address it, because it was so dangerous. It was so perilous. And so, like many of us, when faced with something that is terrible, we just don't want to look at it. But when she discovered many, many, many years later, this is what she wrote. She said that when she discovered the truth about the Stalinist project in the 1950s, she was horrified. She was absolutely horrified. It was one of those moments. There were several in Ursula's life when she did, I think, not openly, but she privately began to question her communist faith, what she'd done all her life. So one has to see her rise through the Red Army against the background of this appalling, brutal, Philistine slaughter taking place in Soviet Russia at that point.
Her Soviet bosses sent her to Switzerland in 1938. Of course, they're right next to Nazi Germany in the lead up to war. What was her task in Switzerland?
Believe it or not, she was running the largest spy network inside the Third Reich. So she had agents who were passing information back across the border into Switzerland, and she was sending it by radio to Moscow. That was her essential job. She had her own agents, but there was a much larger network that was already in place by the time she arrived in the Soviet Union. And she moved into a very pretty little, I've been there actually, little chalet above the lake in Lake Geneva. It looks like picture postcards of a Swiss thing with sort of cowbells and bluebells all over the place. And in her bedroom, she built a very powerful radio transmitter. She built it in the cupboard, concealed in the cupboard, so she could actually sit in bed at night when the children were asleep and transmit to Moscow. And Ursula had her own spies inside the Reich. She, on her way back from Moscow, she'd stopped off in Britain to see her family ostensibly. And one of her jobs, as given to her by Moscow, was to recruit spies British spies who could at that point be then infiltrated into Germany. This is in the build-up to war, so there's no war between Britain and Germany at this point, and carry out sabotage missions, intelligence gathering and sabotage missions. So she recruited 2 Englishmen for that purpose.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So, Ben, in 1938, Ursula was in Switzerland, living as a single mum with her 2 young children in a sweet little farmhouse, and at the same time running the Soviet espionage ring inside Nazi Germany. She'd recruited these 2 Englishmen to send into Germany as spies. How did she recognise them? What was the sort of spycraft that went into their first meeting in Switzerland?
It sounds sort of fantastical in retrospect. If you made it up in a novel, no one would really believe it. But so one of them, who was called Len Burton, a communist, he'd fought in the Spanish Civil War, was simply instructed by Ursula's sister to travel to the little town of Vevey on Lake Geneva, and that he should carry a copy of a newspaper in one hand and a piece of fruit in the other. And he should, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a specific day, he should be standing under a clock tower and keep an eye open for a woman carrying a bag of oranges. She would approach him and she would say, "Do you like ice cream?" And he would say, "No, I prefer whiskey." That was the password. That was the code. Now, it sounds extraordinary because, of course, if you'd been standing in Vevey at that point and you'd heard this exchange between 2 complete strangers, the first thing you would think was, they've got to be spies. This doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, what are they doing? But that is, believe it or not, what happened. And Len Burton, who'd been sent out, he'd been told there was sort of secret work. He hadn't really been told what he was going to do, but there was secret work for him to do in Switzerland. He and another agent were dispatched into the Third Reich by Ursula on sabotage missions. I mean, their job was to create mayhem in Nazi Germany.
How close did they get to Hitler?
So again, one of the bizarre discoveries of this story was that, in fact, they framed an assassination plot to murder Hitler, to knock him out. I mean, They took to having lunch in a restaurant in Munich called the Osteria Bavaria, which actually turned out to be Hitler's favourite restaurant. So they were sitting there when Hitler and his entourage would come in, and they spotted that Hitler always had a meal in the sort of private section behind the kind of very flimsy plywood partition. And they worked out that it would have been comparatively easy to plant a bomb next to that partition and blow him to hell. And of all the plots to assassinate Hitler, and there were several, to my mind, this is the one that came closest to being realised, because it would have been quite easy. And they, on one of their trips back to be debriefed by Ursula, Agent Sonya, as she now was, back in Switzerland, casually they remarked, "Gosh, it'd be quite easy to kill Hitler." And she picked it up, radioed Moscow that evening and said, "There's an opportunity to kill Hitler." It was approved by Moscow. The whole thing was rolling. It would have been a suicide mission. I mean, there's no way they would have survived it. And they were weeks away from actually putting this plan into operation when the Nazis and the Soviet Union struck the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Nazis. And that evening, Ursula received a radio message from Moscow saying, "Stand down, everybody. We're now, there's a non-aggression pact with Germany, with Hitler, and cease all offensive operations." Now, for Ursula, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was another moment of ideological crisis, really, because, the country, the regime that she'd battled all her life, she'd been a vigorous anti-fascist all her life, trying to destroy the rise of Nazism. Suddenly the Nazis were in bed with her own employers, with the Soviet Union. And I think for her, again, it was a moment of real ideological crisis.
You've made the point, Ben, that the various partnerships she had with male espionage agents often took on a romantic hue. What was happening with Ursula and Len Burton?
You see, at this point, Ursula had a problem. which was that her German passport was about to expire. When it did, she wouldn't get another one. She was a German Jew. And at that point, there was a high likelihood that she would be extradited to Germany. She was already on a wanted list in Germany as a known communist, where she would have been murdered, and along with her family. So she needed some legal way to get out of Switzerland if the Nazis invaded, which at that point, it looked quite likely that they would. There was a strong possibility at that point that Switzerland would be Hitler's next target. And so she said to Len Burton, why don't we get married? Why don't we get married? And then I'll be British and I can get a British passport from the consulate, and it means that I can get out. So he was her sub-agent, he was her recruit, he was her spy. But she said, why don't you become my husband? She said, this is completely a marriage of convenience. This wasn't how Len Burton saw it, because Len Burton had fallen in love with Ursula. In fact, he'd fallen in love with her, as he later wrote, from the moment he saw her holding that bag of oranges outside the supermarket in Vevey. And so, looking back on it, again, it's quite funny. I mean, looking back on it, she noticed that he seemed slightly irritated when she said, yes, why don't we get married? And there's no romance involved in this. Because he said, yes, all right, okay, yes, well, why don't we do that? In fact, he was thinking, well, I'm in love with you. I wanted to, And sure enough, that is what happened. They fell in love and they remained happily married for the rest of their lives. So this was a kind of fake marriage built on a kind of spy plot that resulted in a love affair and another child, who is still alive, Peter Burton. He's the one surviving child of Ursula.
In that little picturesque Swiss farmhouse, there was another member of the family, a woman who had actually been Ursula's nanny, was a nanny to her family when Ursula was growing up, and who had come with Ursula to Switzerland to help look after these children that Ursula had. What development happened with that nanny that put Ursula and her family into real danger?
Well, this is Olga Muth, who was the German nanny, a very solid, rather sweet, sort of middle-aged woman who was helping Ursula look after the children. So while Ursula was upstairs on her radio, Olga was looking after the kids. And she became very, very attached, particularly to the little girl, to Nina. And she knew what Ursula was up to. I mean, she was a simple woman in a way, Olga, but she knew that her employer was not a normal kind of housewife. And at this moment that Len and Ursula got married, and Ursula did then duly get her British passport, Olga became terrified, really, that Ursula and Len were going to leave Switzerland, take the children with her, and abandon her. She became frantic about this because she felt that her world was going to fall apart. And so she sort of hatched a slightly mad plot that she would go to the British consulate in Switzerland, denounce Ursula, explain that Ursula was a Soviet spy. And then in Olga's mind, what would happen then was that the British would not give Ursula a passport. Ursula would have to stay in Switzerland. They would simply carry on as they had before, in this sort of domestic harmony as they were living before. And of course, that was never going to happen. But it was a moment of real peril for Ursula. And what happened was that Olga duly did turn up at the British consulate. She attempted to denounce Ursula, but because she spoke no English, she sort of ranted at the poor consular official who had no idea what she was saying. And this denunciation never landed. But by this point, Ursula realised what was happening and realised she had to get out, that she was in real peril now. And so she secretly got the kids out of the house before Olga was back, put them in a sort of what you might even call a safe house elsewhere, confronted Olga Muth, her beloved nanny. Now, they had had a very, very close relationship, and the nanny was spying on the spy. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Len even suggested killing the nanny at one point. So it really did all become domestically fairly dark in that farmhouse.
I would say, but we make light of it, but actually Len was a tough cookie. I mean, Len had seen really brutal fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And he was serious. This wasn't a game. I mean, Len would have done it. I think if Ursula had said, look, we have no choice here, we have to do something radical, Len would have done it. I mean, what a terrible thought that is. And Ursula said, we can't do this. We cannot do this. I cannot be part of this, because there was a limit to what she would have shed blood for the revolution. But the idea of actually murdering her family nanny was too much for her.
And instead she sold her brooch and gave the money to the nanny so that she could fend for herself while Ursula and Len and the kids sought refuge, eventually all together in England. And she was living, first of all, in Oxford as an ordinary working class family. She was continuing with her espionage, and in late summer 1942, she went to a cafe opposite a railway station in Birmingham and met a man. Who was he, Ben?
Well, that was the great Klaus Fuchs. Great from one point of view, not so great from another. Klaus Fuchs was another German refugee. He was a communist. Secretly, he was a communist, and he was a prodigiously talented physicist. Highly intelligent Klaus Fuchs, slightly eccentric, but a really brilliant man. And he was working at that point on the British atomic weapons program, which was leading the way in the development of the atomic bomb. It would eventually be taken over by the Manhattan Project by the Americans. But at this point, it really was kind of the work was being done in Britain. And Klaus Fuchs was right at the center of that project. And by this point, world events had moved on, and Stalin was in alliance with the Allies, with the Americans and the British. And Klaus Fuchs and Ursula believed that it was wrong that the British and the Americans should be developing an atomic weapon without telling the Soviets. That's the crux of what they felt they were doing. And so Klaus Fuchs began to hand over to Ursula the blueprints of the atomic weapon. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, the Soviets did an accountancy job on this after the war when they worked out exactly how much information Klaus Fuchs had passed on. It amounted to more than 600 pages of raw data on how to make a bomb. I mean, that's to simplify things. It was so complicated that Ursula herself simply couldn't. She was not a physicist. She was highly intelligent, but she, by this point, in the privy, in the outside loo behind her house in Great Rollright in the Cotswolds, she had built another very powerful radio transmitter with which she was sending this information back to Moscow. But the stuff that was coming from Klaus Fuchs, and it would come over a long period, was so technical that it couldn't really be sent by wireless. So she was having to meet up with a spy handler from the Soviet embassy in London and pass over prodigious amounts of information. But it's fascinating, really, just how this woman living in this kind of domestic world in the Cotswolds was living this extraordinary double life. By day, she was looking after her 3 children now by 3 different men, baking cakes and attending the local fetes and going to church. And to all intents and purposes...
This committed Marxist went to church.
Yeah, it was cover. It was all cover. And she lived the life of a sort of ordinary refugee housewife in the Cotswolds. In the meantime, she was Colonel Ursula Kuczynski of the Red Army, actually sending back the blueprints of how to build the bomb.
Klaus Fuchs moved to work in America, and his espionage relationship with Ursula came to an end, though she continued her espionage work right up until the end of the war as she's living in this picturesque little English village. Then in 1947, who turned up at her house one Saturday afternoon?
MI5, the security service of Britain, had got onto the fact that something was happening. It's fascinating how long it took MI5 to really get onto the Kuczynskis, because it wasn't just Ursula who was spying. Her brother Jürgen was also a fully paid up Soviet agent. Her father was knowingly providing her with information that she was sending back. So the whole family was in it up to their eyeballs. And in fact, the declassified files on the Kuczynski family stand about 4 feet high. I mean, there are 70 different files on them. But because of the nature of British society, and in fact, Western society as a whole at that point, Ursula, as a woman, was virtually invisible. Because they were investigating the men, sure enough. They weren't sure about Len Burton. They were highly suspicious of Jürgen and his father. But because Ursula was a wife and a mother, she had almost the perfect disguise. But they were circling in because they had worked out that a radio transmitter was operating from somewhere in the Oxfordshire countryside. And in fact, there's a hilarious they were living in an earlier place at this point. There's a police report which a policeman who was sent to kind of investigate the family said, well, there's a very large area outside the house. You may think this is worthy of further investigation. Well, at that point, MI5 did think it was worthy of further investigation. But by 1947, Ursula and Len Burton were under the microscope. And to her little house in Great Rollright were dispatched 2 MI5 officers, including the legendary Bill Scarden. Legendary because he was supposed to be the greatest interrogator in MI5. He looked straight out of central casting. The man was a drooping moustache and a trilby hat. I mean, he was legendary, even though he was, to my mind, wholly incompetent. He was the one who had interviewed many of the Cambridge 5 spy ring and totally failed to realise that they were actually working for the other side. When he turned up at Ursula's house, and Ursula brilliantly answered the door wearing a sort of pinny covered in flour and said, oh, I'm so sorry, do you want to sit in the parlour while I get my husband? I'm just baking a birthday cake for one of my children. And this sort of picture of domestic bliss completely flummoxed both of them. They were sort of incredibly embarrassed, I think, both of them, that they were sort of, that he was a woman and they were supposed to be investigating her and it didn't quite work. And anyway, Bill Scarden utterly failed to put a glove on her. They actually straightforwardly accused her of, she just denied it. She just flatly denied it. She played the old spy trick of, if you deny it for long enough, there's nothing they can do. They've got no evidence. You can't. I mean, she was under suspicion, but they were still uncertain. They just couldn't believe that a woman baking cakes and attending the local fete and looking after it could and in fact, there's a note written by Scarden in the MI5 files in which he says, we have fully investigated this case and we've come to the conclusion that it cannot be Ursula Burton because she is, quote, far too busy with her domestic duties. So
perfect cover.
It was the perfect cover. There is, however, and a conspiracy theory associated with this, which it is conceivable that a man who would rise to become the head of MI5 was actually protecting Ursula, that he was deliberately making sure that she was not prosecuted, that she was not properly investigated. And this is a long, long-running conspiracy theory. I myself don't believe it, but it's possible. It's still a possibility that she was getting help from inside.
So it didn't seem that MI5 were cottoning on to Ursula's activities. What made her decide she had to get out of England?
Finally, Klaus Fuchs was arrested. He confessed. He sort of partially confessed. They had strong evidence against him, and it would take a long time before he confessed everything. But his arrest was reported. It appeared in the newspapers, and Ursula opened her local newspaper one day and saw German physicists arrested. And at that moment, she thought, right, it's only a matter of time before the British interrogators get out of Klaus Fuchs, who was running it. Now, Klaus Fuchs, interestingly, never knew Ursula's real identity. I mean, she had kept that hidden from him, on the old need-to-know basis. But she felt that he probably knew enough to be able to really sink her. And she was right, actually. So she had to get out. She had to get out. So she plotted her escape from Britain, and she had to get out quickly. So her son, by this point, was at university in Aberdeen. Her children, of course, bear in mind, had absolutely no idea what their mother was really doing. She bundled up the 2 youngest, got on a plane, and within a matter of hours, actually, she had flown to East Germany. And she got out. Again, it was a moment of sort of staggering incompetence by MI5, which took weeks to realise that she'd left the country. I mean, you'd wonder why they didn't just have a guard on her immediately. But again, I think her camouflage was so perfect that they were deeply embarrassed with her. They couldn't quite believe that the bird had flown, that she got out.
She'd spent her whole life dreaming of a communist society, fighting for a communist society. Was she happy to be in East Germany? Did it live up to those ideals and expectations she'd harboured for so many years?
Well, it absolutely didn't. I mean, this was not the Soviet socialist paradise that she'd imagined. Would she have said that in public? No. Would she even have said it in private? No. She confided it in her writings, quite dangerously, but clearly disillusionment set in, and Ursula gave up the spying game. It's a really interesting thing, really, because Soviet intelligence was a very difficult club to join, but it was an almost impossible club to leave. Because once you had said, I don't want to do this anymore, you were immediately suspect, particularly in somewhere like East Germany, where everybody was spying on everybody else. But Ursula was contacted by her handlers in Moscow, who actually flew to East Germany to see her, saying, what are you going to do for us now, Agent Sonya? And she said, I'm out of it. I'm not doing this anymore. By this point, she'd done more than a decade of high peril espionage. And it wasn't an ideological decision. I think it was really a personal one. I think she felt she had done enough. And my goodness, she had. She'd got 2 Soviet Orders of the Red Banner. She was a colonel. But she did manage to walk away. And it's in a way, I think it's a tribute to the way that Moscow thought of her, that they simply let her go. Again, I think she was a very dangerous, rather brave thing to do, to walk away from Soviet intelligence.
So in stopping being a spy, she said goodbye to being Agent Sonya. Who did she become instead?
She completely reinvented herself. And this was a woman who had already lived multiple identities as different people in different parts of the world. And she became someone completely different. She adopted the writer's name, completely plucked out of the ether, didn't mean anything, Ruth Werner, she called herself. And she became a highly successful novelist. She began writing fiction for children and young adults. And in fact, she was phenomenally successful. She's been described as the East German equivalent of Enid Blyton. Her books sold in huge quantities. And Ruth Werner became a household name. She became extremely celebrated in sort of communist circles. And nobody knew, including her children, that in fact, for most of her career, she'd been a fully paid up spy.
What did they make of that when it was revealed? How did they find out? And what did they make of their mother's remarkable career?
Well, eventually, in the 1970s, the East German authorities gave Ursula permission to write a memoir. They spotted a propaganda opportunity here, which was that, if they could celebrate Agent Sonya, as this great spy who'd operated in the West, that would look good. So she was allowed to write her memoir, and she wrote it, and she presented it to the Stasi, the sort of internal East German secret police, for vetting. And they took one look at it and said, well, you can't publish this. This is full of, it's all about your emotional life, and you've committed adultery here, and extraordinarily sort of prudish organisation, the Stasi said, this is not on. So they went through it with a red pen and took out all the interesting bits, really. And she was allowed to publish her memoir. But actually, it's a good book, but it's pretty sort of straightforward in the story that it tells. But of course, being the Stasi, being bureaucrats, they kept the original manuscript that they censored, and that is in the Stasi archives today. So it was one of the great sources for this book was that I was able to go to the original manuscript and find the information that the Stasi didn't want you to know about, which was all the interesting stuff about her lovers and her behavior and her internal doubts and the crises of conscience and so on. But the book came out. It did very well in communist circles. It came as a huge shock to her children. It was devastating. By this point, they were in middle age. And I think they never recovered. I mean, I knew Michael Hamburger, the oldest, really quite well in the course of researching the book. And I think for him, it was still a devastating realization. He loved his mother, she loved him, but he'd never known her. He'd never really known her. And there was quite a lot in the book. He read it just before he died that he didn't know about her. Lots, in fact. And he said it was terribly poignant, actually. It was only a few weeks before he died. He was 92. He said, thank you for writing the book. He said, because I now feel I know my mother in a way that I never knew her when she was alive. Because even in old age, Ursula did not tell everything. She kept her secrets. And secrets are toxic, actually. I mean, secrets are very, very bad for you. They're addictive. They're very hard to give up. And these 3 children had been brought up in a family riddled with secrecy. And so I think that the foundations of their world shifted very dramatically at that point, and I think none of them really ever recovered.
What do you think she would have made of your book, Ben, as a woman who lived by secrets?
She would have pretended to be furious, I think. Privately, I think she'd have been thrilled. I think she wouldn't necessarily have enjoyed some of the complexities of her character that I tried to bring out. I mean, this is not a story of a simple heroine. It just isn't. Ursula is a complicated creature. You know, she's very conflicted. I found my relationship with her, if you like, as an author, quite a complex one. Much of her character I admired greatly. Her resolve, her courage, her bravery. But she was also ruthless, absolutely ruthless, and dedicated to a Stalinist regime that was brutal, murderous, Philistine, and appalling. You know, so balancing those two elements of her life is a complicated one, and she was prepared to put her family at mortal risk. You know, but again, we have to be very careful of double standards here, because nobody has ever said to me, "Oh, that Kim Philby, you know, he was a very bad father. You know, he really didn't." You know, so are we holding women, as it were, to a higher standard because they're women and because they're mothers? And I think there is an element of that. We find the idea of a sort of mother prepared to do this more repugnant than we do of a man. And I think, again, one has to be pretty careful about that.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations, Ben.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Ben Macintyre's book is Agent Sonya, and trust me, there are so many extraordinary details and people we didn't get a chance to talk about in this interview, so go and have a look at it. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
Hit subscribe for more, or try out the ABC Listen app for thousands of other podcasts, all ad-free.